Good morning or good day, whatever it is for wherever you are. I am launching this monologue today, the mental obsession monologue, to clarify some things that have been floating in my head, and I'm not sure I always make clear in the midst of a discussion. I can be a little insistent and a little maybe overconfident. I don't know. Seems to me that clarity is worth sharing, regardless of whether it's accepted or whether it is understood or whether it is thought to be anything of value, simply for the sake of offering the opportunity to consider things. And my sense is that thinking is a consideration of things. It's something that a body does with the brain that attempts to come to terms with all the various aspects of sensory information that it's getting and all the details of what's happening that are being received. So it isn't my gut tells me, if my gut speaks at all, that the senses don't have opinions. They simply send us sensory data, and it's what we think about it that seems to be the thing that we make believe is true, make believe is real, when in fact it's just thoughts we're having about the information we're getting. And if those thoughts aren't adjustable and adaptable, one of the primary survival mechanisms is to adapt to conditions that are changing. And if we're fighting that change by making believe what we think is true and real, then we're obviously creating an obstacle within the thinking we can do that actually obstructs thinking's potential to serve us, and as a result becomes seemingly an enemy to us and of us. And that's simply an effect that can be created by misusing thought. So a couple of basic ideas I wanted to share, several actually, and I'm sure it will lead into many others because this conversation can't be so specific as to not include everything, because it's really about everything. It's not about some things against others or some things to the exclusion of others or some things and not others. It's about everything. It's about life. It's about the universe. It's about our basic nature as human beings and nature's nature and the nature of our universe and all of the things that we're intimately involved in, to even be listening or speaking wherever you are, wherever I am now. We're doing that together. So this part of the seeming non-discussion that is a monologue is actually a discussion with your ears and your thoughts, and your responses and your reactions to what's said are your discussion with me and mine with you. And I don't have to see you out there to know you're there. And I don't have to hear you to know you're thinking what you're thinking. So I give you that, I allow that because it's happening. And I've learned to begin to realize that what's happening is happening, regardless of what I think about what's happening. My limitations and thoughts do not constrict what's happening. They only constrict the limitations. They only seem to constrict my ability to go beyond those limits when I begin thinking that they're true and real. And belief systems have notoriously run cultures throughout human history. So this issue hasn't been a new issue. It's been going on as long as people have been thinking that self-indignation is justified reason and excuses to kill other people or harm them in any way or oppress or suppress them. And that's basically human history, the history of that kind of thinking. So introducing ideas that begin to actually melt some of the edges of those thoughts and realize that perhaps we have a greater source of knowing that we've always had, that doesn't change, that's always present and always with us, is only obscured by the preoccupation we have with thinking about our thinking. And it isn't something we shouldn't do. Thinking is something we absolutely do. It's what we have been given to help guide us in the environments we find ourselves in, whatever they are. And everywhere we go, we're thinking. Sleeping, we're thinking. Thinking is thinking. So it isn't thinking we're talking about stopping here. It's how we're thinking and what we're thinking that can convolute thinking's purpose to give us the impression that we can be attacked by our thoughts and we can be attacked by our brain and we can be attacked by ego and that thoughts can be intrusive, etc. We set that up in what we ask them to do and the ideas we have about them that we rely on that are untrue. So a couple of points to consider is that you have no obligation to listen to any of this. There's nothing you have to believe or have faith in or hope in or hear or understand. If you're willing, if the contention here is correct, and you're willing to simply live with what you're hearing for any length of time without dismissing it and judging it and determining, the judgment isn't a problem as much as the idea that it's true, and then it turns into contempt and immediately dismisses anything that might be of value. So what you do or make of what you hear is completely up to you, and it always has been. One thing we seem to have as humans is free will. And what does that mean? Will is effectively choice. So when I want something, I make choices. I don't tend to make choices when I don't want anything. But not wanting something is also a choice, which points out that choice always allows not to be chosen. Addiction, on the other hand, appears to be the only choice. And addiction is essentially based on a mental problem, which is making believe that a lie can be true. So you can make up anything you want, and you can think anything you want, and you can hear anything you want, and you can think you heard what you think you heard. And that's a choice. You can also notice that thinking, if we can see something and only think what we see is what we think about it, then we're not seeing the thing we're seeing. We're really seeing it through the lens of what we're thinking. And if we hear something and think what's being said is only what we think, then we're hearing only what we're thinking. And if I think about my thinking and think that that thinking of itself becomes who I am, I'm not actually thinking about myself, I'm thinking about my thinking, exactly in the same form that I do in this outer landscape that I'm interacting with. So considering these ideas is an awakened meditative contemplation. It's not one where you need to go sit by a quiet pond in some ideal situation where it's very quiet, and then you feel comfortable for a little bit because you've been there. And obviously, meditation allows us to begin to witness that there is something going on that's very, very peaceful in our experience. But if I'm inducing it simply because the environment I'm in is peaceful, and I'm not noticing that peace exists wherever I go, with all the circumstances that can be challenging and obscene at times in terms of being aggressive or violating the space I'm in or the potential I have. Driving's a great example, probably the greatest risk we ever face every day, and take for granted it's relatively safe and we're always going to get where we're going. And it's not the case. There's a lot of ideas about how to drive that are not safe and that put people at risk, and eventually reveal that. So the point is, if I can begin to notice that meditative contemplative state is my natural state, then I begin to notice it's everyone's natural state, and that it's the natural state of nature. And if that's the case, I'm always in that space thinking I'm not, preoccupied by obsessive thoughts trying to become true when in fact they never can be. They're just simply thoughts about things. So to float ideas, to contemplate ideas, is to have them effectively disappear as they seem to fit. We're trying on ideas, basically, in consideration. They will disappear when they fit because it will simply align our thinking to what we've always known. And we will no longer need to think about it because we'll simply apply it. It's like mathematics or hitting a baseball or riding a bike. Once all the obstacles are overcome that are wrong about doing it, we start doing it without thinking about it. And our nature is to be aligned with nature. That's the nature of our existence. It also, given the freedom we have, allows us to go wrong, to choose wrong, to do things wrong. And the experience we have, nervousness, doubt, uncertainty, questionable ideas that we actually recognize and are experiencing, they're actually giving us feedback that is accurate to what we're doing. It's good to know that in thought. It's good to start thinking about things accurately. It's good to notice that the sun does not go up or go down, that we go around. We talk in those terms because that's how things appear to us. But if all we're doing is dealing with appearance, then that's exactly what we're doing with who we think we are, by thinking that our thoughts, which are imagined, thinking about our thoughts that are imagined, all of a sudden imagine that thinking of thinking itself imagines who we are. So that's an illusion. It's not real. It's not true. It's just a projection, an image. And if that image and thought is always changing, then who are we? But something very confused about who we are because it's always new. If we're trying to be somebody, and we already are somebody, we already have somebody, and we're not utilizing that body that we have appropriately, correctly, then the impressions we create are going to be depressing. So once our thinking is aligned with reality and truth, and I would say it always is, except to the contrary thoughts that we maintain, making believe that somehow they're going to save us one day if we continue to maintain them. And that's an obsessive thought. But these thoughts dissolve once we start aligning our thinking with reality and realize that it's real and true regardless of what we think. It starts to take the foot off the gas pedal a little bit in terms of the obsessive thinking. So the shift isn't really a shift. It's a seeming shift from the movement we've been trying to create to get away from that source, to achieve it and find it for ourselves somewhere else, seeking it always, always, always out there somewhere, and begin to realize it's always been where we are, as we are, how we are now. So considering these things is to start noticing we've all had moments where we know we know. And there's no other matter, anyone's ideas, meaning matter, what matters, when the situation is clear. The gravity of the situation is clear because there's no mass in knowing. There's no mass in life. There's no, the essence of light, for instance, has no matter. It's no mass. And light has always been considered to be this elevated state of awareness, consciousness. So if we're busy casting shadows on our experience, the doubt, they're shadows of doubt, literally, that we're casting and maintaining ideas that seem like clouds, blocking the light and causing this haunting effect that something's seriously wrong. And the only thing seriously wrong is that we're taking it seriously rather than beginning to see it's just something we're doing, something we're free to do, something we're capable of doing, and something that we're doing when we're experiencing those effects. Keep in mind, effects are always based on a cause, and a cause always precedes effects, but effects are immediately caused, immediately. So it doesn't take 6 months or a year or 10 years to get enough pain to begin to face what we're doing. It doesn't take that at all. We've just become so accustomed to denying and thinking that control over what's happening is pretending it's not happening, and pretending because it's uncomfortable, if we can pretend it's not happening and feel like it's not happening for any amount of time, that's actually a success formula or a formula for success, when in fact we're learning to deny things and ignore things. And ignorance certainly isn't a good source for intelligence. Sensitivity is in fact a form of awareness and intelligence. It's an awareness that can seem overwhelming when we've been scripted in our own narrative to think that what we are here to do is hide what's going on and pretend what's happening isn't happening, and think that the momentary sense that we can do it will someday be successful, and then live with the haunting dread of the fact that we keep pushing things down and down and down into what we call our subconscious, and think that someday they'll all straighten out on their own while we're busy maintaining the cloud cover that keeps them down there and has us feel that they're not here now, when in fact we're witnessing in the effects that we're feeling, being out of control, right? That's a sensation of saying, I don't have any control here. I can't continue to maintain these things forever because it takes a lot of energy. I'm taking more and more attention away from what's happening, thinking that what isn't happening needs to be attended to, when in fact, it isn't even happening, this thing I'm doing, other than the thinking I'm doing that gives it credit that's undue. That's insanity. And if you look in the world today, you'll see that there's a lot of insanity going on. lot of jockeying for power and position and place that is not going to have any bearing. 100 years from now, none of it's going to matter to anybody that's here now. And to think that it matters in the meantime is a very short-sighted, selfish form of thinking. Same way we think the sun goes up and down, that's seeing it as it appears rather than as it actually is. We are perfectly capable of seeing things how they are because we know how they are, because we're built on a platform of that knowledge. Nature is our nature. As nature's nature is nature, it is our nature, just like it is every inanimate object's nature. Inanimate objects in the universe do not argue with one another. They are not in conflict with one another. They do not oppose one another. They seamlessly interact, and their interactions, while they can be seemingly violent in terms of the explosive nature of stars collapsing and building and growing and suns burning at temperatures that seem completely inhospitable to us, they're doing exactly what they're designed to do without an argument. Whatever they are now, they will succumb to being for the sake of continuing to be in a process of change that is constant, and as a result, nothing changes because of that constant nature. That's been recognized for thousands of years by thinkers. Maybe not including all the cosmological issues we've come to terms with or think we understand. But I believe Aristotle, thousands of years ago, understood that at the basis of everything was an atom. There was something in a substructure that seemed to exist that was invisible, but was elementary to existence. Pretty good insight for a guy who was living during a time when they, I think, wrote things on stone tablets or were pretty close to that period of time. So if he could see it, we know it now. We are it now in terms of our essence. Applying thoughts accurately offers us a clear view of how our modus operandi, our modes of operating, can be improved and function. But getting better has often meant feeling better about acting worse in that denial sense, that sense that was just mentioned about pretending what's happening isn't happening is a way of pretending that we're desensitizing and numb to what's happening. That's actually a death wish, because numbness, not feeling, is in fact a sign of death. When they're wondering about whether somebody's still alive, they look for signs of life. One of them is breathing, condensation, the movement of the body in any way. They put lights in people's eyes to see if there's any response there. So responsibility is responsible. Reactivity is a repetition of thoughts and actions in the name of thinking that somehow something wrong will be right the longer and harder we use it. That's obsessive. That's obsessive thinking. Emotional sobriety is about sane living. Sobriety itself, when it comes to any symptom, is about sanity, because we're being restored to a point of looking at what we're doing as being insane to think that somehow it will work while we continue to have evidence that it will never work, that it's never worked so far. Why do we expect it will work, if not for an insane idea that we're managing about eventual control that never seems to be present? And there is nothing happening anywhere but in the present. And you and I and everyone has never been anywhere but in the present, while we are thinking about things not happening, and again get the selfish idea that we're not in the present simply because we're thinking we're not in the present. To think about things that aren't happening is exactly what was described early on in this conversation about things that we think we see, and things that we think we hear, and things we think about ourselves. That isn't ourself, and that isn't what's heard, and that isn't what's seen. It's what we think. To have that buffer become the source of our seeming reality is to have no reality at all as the source of our reality, and that is insane. So when we think, our job is to pay attention to things that aren't happening in the name of thinking someday and hoping someday and wishing someday and having faith someday and believing someday they will happen. We're busy denying what is actually happening. The reliability of what's happening is what's happening now in the present. And nothing is ever happening that is not happening in the present, ever, other than in thought. Lies, past, future, ego, all those things, addiction, all those things are based in thought. And if something based in thought has no applicable purpose, it has no connection to reality because it's simply induced by the thinker thinking about their thinking. Now, again, this isn't something we shouldn't do. This is something we're well capable of doing, given the state of our world today and thinking today. It's obvious we're perfectly capable of doing this. So to think while we're doing it, we shouldn't be doing it, is to think that while we're doing it, it can't be happening. And to think what's happening can't be happening is a major breach in observation. Because if it's happening, it's happening. And if I'm thinking those sick thoughts about things, or I'm thinking about things only as I think of them and finally come to terms with I'm actually just thinking about what I'm seeing and I'm only thinking about what I'm hearing, I think what I'm hearing is only what I think, not what's actually being said. I begin to realize why people occasionally say, you don't see me and you don't hear me. You never listen to me. Because I'm busy listening to what I'm thinking. I'm not bridging that gap and saying, let me do what I can to actually hear this person and actually be with this person and hear what they're saying. And they're really just sharing with me their thoughts. So it's no different than what I'm doing. The only difference is if I make believe I know exactly what they're thinking. And by the way, it's not too hard to read when people are telling stories about what they're thinking in justification of thinking that their thinking is right and real while they're struggling with doubt and other things. I'm not suggesting listening to people and enabling them to continue doing what they're doing that's harming them is the best model. But if I'm not noticing clearly what they're doing, I've got nothing to say or offer to them that would be of any meaning. And I would suspect self-consciousness is defined as, or self-conscious is defined as undue regard for appearance. Think about that. If our self had conscious, that would be one of the highest achievements of a being in this universe. And yet, what does it mean? We're worried about how we look. Why? Because the appearance of who we look is a projected image. It isn't the appearance of how we look. Is based on what we think we need to project to be the thoughts we're projecting, when in fact those thoughts are always changing, leaving us in constant doubt as to whether or not we're actually achieving that goal, constantly having to reframe and reframe and reframe and start to insist and get people around us to start to agree that who I am is what I think and all those kind of things. And they're not helping us at all, except to the degree that they're helping us get better at doing something that's absolutely insane. Now, insanity does not need to be to the point where we're completely incapacitated and unable to deal with the daily functions of life, which is often how we think of it, like addiction and alcoholism and that. I had ideas that somebody had to be in the gutter wearing pants that they had pissed and shit in with holes in them, couldn't stand up, constantly drunk to be an alcoholic. Found out that's not true. There's all kinds of alcoholics in all kinds of places, in all kinds of positions today that look like they're managing things just fine. It's the same with insanity. The stigma of alcoholism with Alcoholics Anonymous, as a matter of fact, was seen as something that anonymity, which is a faceless essence, so there's no personality in anonymity, so we're all unified in that maintaining anonymity gave people a chance to overcome the stigma of admitting they were alcoholics. But the stigma of insanity is much greater than that, because it's something that's been so pervasive through human history that even the people that pointed the finger at the alcoholics and the drug addicts and all those that they wanted to say they weren't better than are often thinking the exact same kind of sick thinking. They're just functioning a little bit better and trying to use that functional capacity as an excuse to say their thinking's just fine, thank you. Don't bother me. Don't contradict me. Don't fight me. Don't argue with me. Don't say anything I don't like, because if you do, I'll come get you. That's been pretty common through history. And most relationships are all based on how well we manage the agreement not to get too close to somebody. Because if we happen to mention what people are thinking isn't what we're thinking, it often leads to collapses of relationships. Because if I take that self I'm promoting that only appears to be real and that is only illusion being projected and make believe it's real, it's all based on thought. So any contrary thought seems to subject my life to a life-threatening situation, which would justify my defending myself at all costs. When all it is another thought. Emotional sobriety is about sane living. This doesn't mean we can't go or do wrong. It means that when we do go wrong, when we have wrong thoughts, when we have conflicting thoughts, when we have inner conflict, when we have emotional turmoil, we can start seeing it as our body language and a guide to what we're doing now, right now. The discomfort comes immediately. The discontent comes immediately. The disturbance happens immediately. The irritability is a consequence of all those things because we're starting to get protected because we're worried about something that we're not willing to admit we're doing. And it's going to make us highly susceptible to everything around us in terms of our own reactive potential. Thinking we need to drop thinking's hammer. We need to condemn ourselves. We need to beat ourselves up. We need to abuse ourselves. Is abusing a self that is all made up. It's helping a self that is all made up. We can do all the things self-help suggests and still need more help to maintain it because we're actually giving it credit for actually existing. And now that we're dealing with sanity and insanity, insanity is the idea that things that don't exist are real. Things I hear and see all of a sudden become things that don't actually exist. So if I'm thinking about myself and I'm thinking about others and I'm thinking about things only as I think of them, I'm not thinking about those things at all. I'm thinking of them only as I think of them. It's like a lens and a telescope being read and thinking the entire universe is red. It's a choice and it's an option. And the abuse that comes from it, the self-loathing, the self-fear, the anxiety, the stress, the disorders, is putting thinking first as our reality and our truth and our sole source, and thinking everything is secondary to that. That's the disorder. It's just a disorder in thinking. If there is a knowing absolute nature anywhere, then we know that nature. We are that nature. That is our nature. And to miss that point in the name of trying to constantly feel better about what we're doing that's wrong. And I've worked with a lot of people and nobody's ever come to me and said, I want to feel worse and I want to generate more negative ideas. That to me is a very good indication that what we're doing is worse and how we're trying to fix it isn't better. It's actually helping refine the worse because we're denying the cause. We're treating the effect. We're treating how we feel, coming up with all sorts of ways to feel better. But what are we feeling better than, but what's worse? That's addiction, and that's mental addiction in a nutshell. There's nothing to get if we have it all already. Nothing. There's nothing out there to get. We've got it. In the present is where everything that's happening is happening. If everything isn't enough, what are we going to get that will be? Where are we going to go that will finally be the place we thought we needed to finally be all the things we could be? It starts to make little sense. The prods, the will, the self-will, this idea that the will is based on these sick thoughts I have about myself, means that self-will, running rampant, running wild, run riot, is in fact constantly simply trying to resolve itself when in fact there's no resolution to it. Resolution is a resolution, constantly trying to fix what's constantly being broken. There's no resolution there. That's why New Year's resolutions last about 3 weeks. If we spend the whole year not willing to do something and then think all of a sudden magically it's going to happen because we pass a specific day in the year, that's really fantasy. It's really fairy tale. It's really just imagination. And is it possible? Absolutely, it's possible. But is it possible any day of the year? Of course. In any moment? Yes, all the time. But what is impossible is maintaining the problem while trying to fix the effect. Because what's the effect going to be? Maintained. What's the cause going to be? Overlooked, ignored, not looked at honestly. What's the cause? My thoughts, my choices. Consequences are consequences. They're consequential, sequential to what I'm thinking, to cause. Effect is consequential to cause. If we're always in the present and the only thing we have that has been giving us another impression is that we think we're not, then again, thinking is the culprit here. And it isn't thinking, it's the way we're using thinking by thinking is the solution rather than seeing thinking as simply a potential expression of what we know. When I apply things that I know, they work. When I do them, I don't need to think about them again because the satisfaction and fulfillment of things functioning is easy to remember because it's so fulfilling. It confirms the rightness of the action, the rightness of the thought, and it eliminates needing to think of it much at all. Because I know what's going to happen if I do A plus B, whatever that is. There's nothing to get if we've got it. And yet that freedom to begin to see that allows us to begin to make choices that aren't based on desperation and conflict and inner turmoil to overcome anything. They're based on peace and love and generosity and inclusion and the potential to affect everything in a way that is beneficial for everything. We're already affecting everything by what we choose. But mental contagion of this disease is as quickly spread as health, except in one regard. The contagion is only happening as a result of thinking, and the rightness is already in place regardless of thinking. It's just a nature that's natural. Doesn't come and go because we think of it that way. This begins to challenge the preoccupation of our human experience, thinking that everything is relative and I can make this choice or I can make that choice. An absolute present state of being is not a choice. It's not an option. And yet, in choosing within the relative, we think if we don't choose and fight for the point we're making or the position we've taken, that we're condemned to that position. We feel condemned by all the other potential positions that don't allow us to take that position freely, while in fact taking that position confirms the freedom of all those other positions be taken by all those people and thoughts that might want to take them. Within the infinite, there is no giving or taking. There is no giving or receiving. It's just an absolute state of everything already being everything. There's no beginning or end. For our human experience, how that translates is that the moments are always new. We're always new in the new moment. What does that mean? All possible things are possible in every moment. Where is that moment? Where we are. What does that mean? Everything's possible. That's possible. And you know what's also possible? To think the impossible is possible. That's exactly what we do in this obsessive process, is to make believe thoughts we're holding that are thoughts that aren't right, they aren't correct, are true. And we rely on them. And what do? Rely over and over and over again to maintain them, thinking the desperation that's being created means we need to hang on tighter, hang on longer, think harder, and somehow it will get better. When in fact, that's exactly what an alcoholic, a drug addict, a gambling addict, a food addict, a sex and love addict, a debtor, all those different variations of programs that are out there to help people begin to function in relation to their dysfunction are all revealed in that single thought. It's always about a thought. It's always about a mental problem. And every one of the programs tracks back to the mentality, because the primary addiction is thinking. Mental, how we think, how we mistake thinking, how we misuse and misutilize our potential and our capacity by thinking is the sole source. So the nature of a lie is an attempt to reverse the natural order of things. So contemplate these things. Again, this is your choice. You have a freedom. You can dismiss this. You can shut this down. You do not need to listen. If you're interested in your experience and you've noticed a struggle in that experience and think it's been impossible to stop, I guarantee you that's not true. But it will be true, and you will guarantee it as long as you continue to maintain the thinking you're doing about it. That's a guarantee. Wrong and failure is guaranteed, absolutely, just as success and functional capacity is guaranteed. It's just a choice, and we're free to make it. You're free to make it. So if that's the case, it's up to you to do what you do to continue it or to begin to disband the rumors that you've been spreading in your brain and start to see that dispelling these rumors is literally taking the words apart that we've been using to justify them and repeating them and reacting in ways that we constantly try to tell a story to excuse ourselves from what we're doing, which means to be excused from what we're doing means we have no capacity or influence in the world whatsoever, and that's not accurate at all. We have plenty of opportunity. We can do, if we're affecting everybody by everything we're doing and what we're doing is wrong and we're ashamed to admit it, so we think we don't have anything to do with it, that's a very interesting direction to go and not notice that what we're ashamed of is that we're affecting everybody and don't want them to see that we're the one doing it. Because again, we think their opinion of us could threaten our life because their thinking about us is what we depend on. Why? Because we think who we are is what we think. So thought becomes the greatest potential threat. So the nature of lie is only attempting to reverse it's attempting to reverse the natural order of things. So lies last as long as they are thought to be true. Okay, so here is something in thought that is claiming only to be what it can't be, true. Since a lie as a lie is no longer a lie, once I say I'm lying, nobody believes the thing I'm trying to promote and or the thing I'm actually believing in. I mean, this kind of lying that disrupts us internally is lying to the self by thinking the self we're talking to and thinking of is in fact who we are. That's the basic lie. Of course, I'm embarrassed. In college, I remember them saying that public speaking was the last class most people take because they're so afraid to be spoken, to talk out loud with groups of people. Interesting. We're in the midst of billions of people and humans, and we're afraid to actually talk to them. Our talking is an expression of our thoughts. If our thoughts are buried in who we think we are, we're afraid of everything they're thinking when we're standing there and see all those eyes looking at us. That isn't what they're doing, it's what we're doing that's primarily affecting that. We can't stop everybody else from doing what they're doing, because if we're free to think as insanely as we do, certainly they are too, and they will absolutely judge us in ways that we can't even imagine when we think what we need to imagine is they're only thinking of us in the ways that we think we are. It's just crazy. So if a lie is only presenting itself to be the opposite of what it is, the obsession is constantly trying to maintain that someday it will be true. Never happens in the present when everything is happening and where everything is happening and how everything is happening. It always happens in imagination in some other place and time. Seeking some higher power that seems to be somewhere else is another way of admitting we don't think it's here now. And if it's infinite, isn't it interesting that the one place we don't think it is the place that we're preoccupied with our own thinking as being reality? If we're creating reality, then we are displacing reality and thinking we can. That's insane if you start thinking about an infinite source as somehow having a gap in it that allows us to create our own reality. And how wouldn't these realities be in conflict if they're all different because we think differently and we have different experience, and even in some small variation would always put us in conflict with everybody and everyone all the time? That is not a seamless effort like nature operates in, where nature is absorbed in the process of what's happening in whatever way it's happening without consideration for its seeming self at whatever subatomic level that might mean, whatever tiny piece that would say, what am I doing? I can't be doing this. I shouldn't be doing this. This shouldn't be happening. I'm not a part of this. I don't want anything to do with this. I want to pretend that I'm somewhere else with somebody else and something else. And what I really need is someone else, somewhere else with more or less of something else to get over this. We do that in thinking. That's it. So a lie only attempts to prove it's what it can never be, which means it has no basis in reality. If what I'm thinking about has no basis in reality, then expressing it will always dysfunction. It will always break down. It will always cause conflict that is repulsed by others and things. It has no place, literally. So what do we think? We have no place. We are disconnected. We are displaced. We are alone. Why? Because we think what we're thinking that has no basis is who we are. What we're actually witnessing in those feelings we have of being separate, being alone, being disconnected, being detached, being unable, all that stuff is a disabled thought that has no basis, no place, can't be expressed in reality. So one of the definitions of obsessive thinking is that it's only happening in thought, just like a lie only happens in thought. It doesn't have any reality to it because it has no basis. It's trying to create its own basis by constantly thinking of itself. And that self it's thinking of is thought. It's not us. So as you start to witness your experiences, the somatic bodily sensations you're getting, that's your body language speaking to you in a domestic language, by the way, not a foreign language that we like to think it is so that we can pretend dismissing it as the thing to do and getting over it and feeling better at it. Starting to say, when I feel wrong, what I know, in my experience, when I feel wrong, I know that what I am feeling is a thought that is wrong. And when I feel bad, I know that I am feeling a thought that is bad. And when I feel useless, I'm feeling a thought or a bundle of thoughts that are useless, that have no basis. So my body is perfectly equipped to convey to me what I'm doing. And what do I do with those thoughts when I'm addictive and in that obsessive thought? Think I got to feel better than them and get over them. Anything but simply resign myself, concede to them, and begin to notice that these bodily functions are actually giving me perfectly accurate information if I'm willing to think of it in the terms that I'm hearing rather than think of it in the terms I'm thinking I'm hearing. Again, that divestment of our investment as humans is the depreciation of our appreciation for what is actually happening. So once we think our thoughts are our imaginary thoughts are reality, we immediately think who we are is what we think. That's it. Like any lie. So this falls in line with the same basic thinking. So what other people think about us becomes critical. How we project ourselves becomes critical. We're preoccupied with thinking about that more than actually thinking about what's going on. Why wouldn't attention deficit disorder become a primary issue today if we were thinking about what was happening? It would not be the case. We're thinking largely about what's not happening, and we're helping enable people think more and more about what's not happening by giving them more and more latitude to think what they're thinking is sane when they're imagining things that aren't even happening. And we're feeding this. We're each doing it to the degree that we're not noticing we're doing it. So whatever the other people think becomes really important. We don't want anybody else to have any doubt in us because it would reveal their doubtful thoughts about us. Why? Because we're doubting our own existence. We're doubting our own experience. We're doubting our own self. Once the basis of my existence is fatally flawed, I feel my life depends, the desperation depends on maintaining this insanity to finally bring it to life, to resuscitate it, and that has no life. To think of ego as dying, to think of ego as something that needs to be crushed or eliminated, is to think of it as being real. It's simply what we're thinking about the self we have that isn't true. Ego is interestingly enough, that the root of ego as a word is I, capital I. And how we use it is a little I. And a little I looks a lot like a head with a body and no arms or legs, no functional capacity to do anything except think. So what do? Spend a lot of time thinking and not much doing productive things in the essence of that thinking. If I'm standing in front of a mirror, the mirror is going to show me what I am, what my stance is. It's not going to change my mask. It's not going to show me what I think I'm seeing. It's going to show me what is there. And yet, if I'm looking at that mirror and thinking it's who I am, I've already assigned myself to being a reflection and an image. And this is common, but we're actually not seeing ourselves as we actually are. We're seeing ourselves exactly backward. And that, again, is the lie, thinking it can be what it isn't. These images we project are not who we are. They're just things we do. Thinking is something we do. We can't be what we do. We are the beers of the doing of that thinking. So we're introducing in this conversation the knowing nature of our being awareness is absolutely intact, and we know it. And you know it as you start noticing how much you fight for the thing that has no basis, because there is no fight in something that has an absolute basis and is absolute knowing. There's no fight at all because there is no risk to it. There is no threat to it. There is no defense that's needed for it. So noticing the defensiveness, reactive, impulsive, and compulsive behaviors all fit the same category of this mental instability and the mental disability of trying to make believe that somehow or another we're going to get better thinking harder about what we're doing. So understanding, I want to broach this for a second. Understanding is the way we see things that aren't visible. So if we're misunderstanding and only relying on what we think is visibility, the things we think we're doing, the things we think we're hearing, the things we think they're doing, the things we think that are happening, we're not noticing that there's a substance to all of those things. We're simply looking at the forms of all those things, how things appear, the basis of all those things in terms of how they project themselves to us. And we, like them, are seeing only the appearance, and we are projecting only the appearance of who we think we want to be seen as. So understanding is how we see substance that seems to be invisible to our eyes. And I want to mention something else. Your eye. Your eyes obviously are what all of us use to see things, if we can see. Interesting, they can't see themselves. An eye never looks at themselves. Interesting. So if we are this knowing, we don't have to see it to be able to see it. We don't have to think of it in terms that we know to begin to see that we know it regardless of what we think. Just like the eye knows what to do when we open the lid in the morning, knows to see what it sees. It doesn't argue over what it sees. It doesn't tell us what it sees. It simply provides information that we then think about. So understanding, when we understand things, is a standing on a foundation that isn't lost. A foundation cannot be lost. So once we understand things correctly, rather than misunderstand things, the stability of our foundation becomes obvious. It's always been that way. We just built a platform above it, thinking we could escape it and thinking we could conquer it and thinking we could get credit for it, that was shaky. So understanding is noticing that our standing is in perfectly stable order, and mental stability follows that order because that's the natural order. We're naturally designed to heal. If we have done something wrong, our bodies know it and they're naturally designed to heal. Now, at some point, our body's designed to disintegrate, to take this integration of all these elements that have come together to form our body, and also the integration of all aspects of life, meaning the absolute, the infinite, all of it, not some of it. And in the midst of that, we return that body to its essence because it's never left its essence. It's just been performing a life form function while we've been experiencing our experience. So that goes to the point that's often said that we are humans. Either we are humans having a spiritual experience or we are spiritual having a human experience. And I would say the absolute order of things would be absolute first rather than secondary, rather than something we need to get to, which would give us credit for creating it. something we're created from or a product of. Whether we're created from it or not is an argument that has been through human history. But if we're a product of it, at least we can begin to assign our reality to it and recognize that if it's mine, it's yours too. It's something we all share. So we can talk about it openly and have revelations and insight that are collectively beneficial, because if we know what we know and we start talking about it, there's going to be an immediate click within the thinking that's going to stop perpetuating the ideas that it has, desperately thinking there's nothing else to know, because all of a sudden the knowing awareness becomes, we become aware that we're aware, and we're always aware that we're aware. We're simply thinking so obsessively that we're not, that we think fueling the obsession is someday going to prove that it's true, rather than the truth is in fact the stability that we always have. So that's a little bit about understanding. Let me just look at something. Another thing to think about. There's a lot of ideas about this evil force in the universe and so on and so forth. If there is, there is. But if the evil force is exactly what we're doing in our own thinking by lying, it doesn't have any basis, any more basis than the lying we do. It's only imagined, and it's only perceived to have power, when in fact all it does is create disruption and destruction, but it doesn't have any effect on an infinite source. So if our infinite source is infinite, there is nothing out there to fear except the thoughts we have about the thing being real, just like our own thoughts of our own self and the selves around us that seem to be threats. No different. So our growth is to look at how much we've shrunk things down to seem to fit this small case we've been trying to make, and then wonder why we feel less than all the time and need more self-confidence and need more self-help and need more self-knowledge and more self-love. Why would we love a self that's born in fear and dread and misery? The self we think we are is not who we are. So to think it is who we are is to think in very fearful ways, which should create a sense of anxiety and stress and fear in our bodies. Why? Because our bodies are built on a platform that's right, and they recognize wrong immediately. Thinking about it is beginning to suspend the idea that coming to a conclusion is critical, but starting to notice that if we simply live with it, and this goes back to the beginning, if we simply live with it and consider it, it'll be obvious that we have a connection to the things that actually occur for us. You don't have to listen to my words and think you need to understand what I'm saying. You don't need to think what I'm saying is true or real or has anything to be faithful in whatsoever. It's not a requirement, as I said earlier. But if you just float the idea and let it float and live with it, you may begin to notice that your process, without even thinking about it, because nature is nature, you don't need to think about it for it to be true. You've always known it. So as it becomes more apparent to your thinking will just stop thinking about it. So the process you're used to of thinking about getting somewhere stops. And all of a sudden you'll notice the effect is that something is happening that gives you a greater sense of awareness, or that is allowing you to see things in new ways, and things are starting to open up. And you'll see that. You'll notice that because your thinking is being let off the hook. It's not being charged with the idea of doing what it can't do anymore. So it's not scrambling around desperately. And the beauty of that is to see how willing thinking is to take our direction, whatever that direction is. It is designed, we are its master of sorts. And to turn it into a slave is to become both the master and the slave simultaneously. We are the observer of our thoughts. We are the doer of our thoughts. We are the chooser of our thoughts. And I will go on to add, this might be another segment, but if we're free to choose, then we want exactly what we choose. And if we want what we choose, we also want the consequences that come. And to think we don't want the consequences, again, goes back to this idea that we shouldn't be thinking what we're thinking. And we're so used to thinking we can wiggle our way out of it while we're actually doing it, that we then think, I don't want this wasn't what I meant. I didn't mean to hurt you. Well, if somebody's hurt as a result of what happens, that's what was intended, because it's what happened. Now we're starting to talk in terms that align with what's happening, rather than constantly give this idea that we can manipulate it and manage it and twist it and turn it and come up with all sorts of new ways to look at it to convince ourselves we have nothing to do with it. Think about that. If we have nothing to do with anything, we're effectively arguing for death. We're asking not to exist. And why wouldn't we be shy and ashamed and feel guilty if we were asking for the one thing we've been given freely, to not even exist, to simply compensate for the thinking we're doing about it that seems so real and so true and so accurate that there seems to be nothing we can do about it, which is a very convenient excuse to also begin to see that we think it's all we can do because we're addicted to it. Addiction is a lie. It's the idea that we can do the thing that we cannot do, and if we do more of it, we'll eventually accomplish it. Consider these things. We talk about it weekly. I'm not sure our conversations are always as elevated as they potentially could be, but I know that they are insightful to the degree that they can be, given what we do is what we do when we talk. I talk about this because I don't think there's anything more interesting to talk about, and I don't think there's anything more contemporary to look at in a world that is failing in many, many ways, and struggling in many ways, and suffering in many ways. And I am a part of that world. That world is not apart from me as it is not apart from you. And a lot of what I am sad about isn't just the sadness I create by the ideas I have that are pitiful and self-pitiful based on the pitiful self I think I am. They are an awareness of people being harmed by the things I have done by maintaining ideas that aren't true and not being willing enough and honest enough to express those things. I lived most of my life compromising my words while having a greater sense of something that I knew was better and I knew was true, and yet faltered by doing what seemed to be acceptable socially and polite and nice. And it isn't polite or nice to lie to people. It isn't polite or nice to be dishonest. And if there's any benefit humans have, it's been beginning to actually share our experience. I have learned, and this wasn't something I thought of when I was a kid, that sharing honestly doesn't mean being right. It means simply sharing what I'm thinking. And if what I'm thinking is wrong, there's relief in sharing it because it gives a pathway to others to begin to do the same, rather than constantly defend against what they're saying because they think all they say has to be something everybody else thinks is true too, or real, or righteous enough to demand everybody else believe. When I think my thoughts are true and real, I think I have to insist that everybody else think the way I do, rather than say, think whatever you want. I'm happy to have you think what. It's interesting actually to hear what you happen to say and think, because I know it's just a thought. It's just another way of looking at the same thing that we're looking at. If something is what it is and we're looking at it and thinking of it in different ways, that thing isn't changing, though we may have an impact on it, just like we have create impressions in our experience, but those impressions collectively turn into depression for all of us. So I'm glad to have your ears wherever you are, whoever you are, whatever you're doing. This thing we share is not divisible. It is indivisible. It is inviolable. It can't be violated. The terms of it can't come and go. It's immutable. It can't be silenced, and yet it is silent. Irony becomes the essence of this absolute nature. And the ability of seeing that the paradoxes, any paradox that we think of, like the idea within sobriety that we give away what we learn and have to keep it, we begin to see that isn't a paradox at all. The paradox is thinking that it isn't that way, that when we give something away, we lose it. We don't have it. We don't have as much of it. That's the paradox, because the nature of nature is an absolutely infinitely abundant knowing essence. It does not have limits, and it does not limit us. We are the limiters. We are the choosers. We are the ones who have created a culture of beliefs that are not true and systems of belief that are not true, that we make believe are true because everybody else does it. No, well, I might as well go along with it too. We suffer as a result of that. Physical disease, our body's ability to maintain its own functional capacity is undermined. Every bodily system is undermined by stress. So here's all these bodily systems, we almost don't think about it all. We worry about things that aren't happening, while the things that aren't happening, we don't say, wow, this is a marvel of activity going on in our immediate awareness and vicinity. We don't think about them at all, but the stress we create undermines every single one of those things. So our thinking actually has a derogatory, negative, disintegrative effect on the things that are so beautifully designed. And the sad irony of that is that we're doing that to prove we have control, because the only thing we ever create in this self-centered world that we think we're living in, that doesn't even exist, is misery and depression and dysfunction and delusion as being reality. It's all that it is. It's an idea that doesn't even exist, thought to exist. Seeing and hearing things that don't exist is a good definition of insanity. And we're talking to ourselves and think there's a self to talk to. Doesn't say, I'm not suggesting we can't do that, but when you start thinking about the thing you're talking to is your thinking, then talking to your thinking, the talking you're doing is based on the thinking you're doing. Now you're just creating a loop, and it seems to make a lot less sense when you begin to realize that the thinking you're thinking about is simply thinking about the thinking you're thinking about, and that maybe there's a little more going on out there, possibly, than what you're actually thinking. And beginning to concede that is beginning to notice that you've had a knowing awareness all along, and you've been grieving and mourning the moments you thought you lost to the preoccupation. It wasn't the circumstances that you attached to the tears and the consequences that you attached to the situations that you felt so dramatically were losses. It's the accumulation of losing and losing and losing the experience, the full experience of the moment. While you've never lost it, you've just thought you had, because your investment in thought has been so deep as to make believe that it is your only reality. And that is not true. And it is not true for anyone or anything anywhere. It never will be, no matter how long we perpetuate the myth. You know it. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, you know this. And as you begin to concede a little bit, there is a good chance that you will melt and have some tears and allow that grief that is built up to be expressed and begin to eliminate the discompassionate tendencies and the reactive tendencies, and start to notice the natural embrace that you have for everyone around you and the regard you have for them, because you begin to see you as part of them rather than apart from them. And I have never had as many tears as I have in noticing this, because beginning to see it is beginning to see something that's very disturbing, and to be with it long enough to allow it to melt is to allow the tension in the body to start to actually relax, because we've been storing this charge in our bodily systems through the tension we've created. And the accumulation of that has not done us much good physically. Most of us do not get more flexible as years go by. And certainly that's been the case for me. So I say that to you as a very moving comment, because I know wherever you are, whoever you are, whenever you are, is now. And I know you're here, and I know you're listening. I don't have to know who you are and where you are to know that. You know that too. So this concession is the beginning of actually beginning to see that what we think is what we think. And it's something we do. And who we are is the observer of that thinking. And we may be the chooser. I don't know. I haven't really come to conclusions. We may be the chooser, but the choosing seems to happen within the thinking, because it doesn't seem to me an absolute source has a choice, but it has the absolute basis of peace, from which choices that can lead to peace and direct peace can be made, rather than the desperation of a self that doesn't exist, fighting for itself and fighting everything and everyone as a result of it, and thinking its decisions are going to be helpful rather than destructive and diseased. If we have anything to give, it's the love we've been given. And if we express it, there's a fulfillment in that clearly eliminates any ideas, shadows of doubt that we've collected cloud cover that we think we're under and think the sun isn't shining because the clouds are out. We talk that way. To begin to see this is to begin to see things on a profound level and begin to see that life is an incredible adventure and exploration. And certainly it isn't limited by any of the things we think. And we're welcome to think whatever we want. And when we begin to be free from that, by seeing that accurately, it gives us a chance to know what we know without any interference and without any interruption, because it's never been there other than the delusional ideas we've maintained that said that it was there. Peace.